nobody at Cedar Ridge Primate Sanctuary thought it was going to work. Not Dr. Fiona Cole, who had spent 14 years rehabilitating capuchin monkeys and had seen enough failed interventions to fill 2 filing cabinets. Not the 3 keepers who sat in the staff meeting and listened to the proposal in complete silence. Not the volunteer coordinator who said, out loud, that this was either the most creative idea she had ever heard or the most irresponsible one, and she genuinely could not tell which. The proposal was simple. Mochi, a 3-week-old capuchin infant found alone in a parking lot in Savannah, was dying. Not from injury, not from disease, from the specific, quiet kind of failure that happens when a primate infant loses its mother before its nervous system has learned how to exist without her. Mochi was not eating, was not sleeping for more than 40 minutes at a stretch, was not making the contact sounds that capuchin infants make when they feel safe. She was present in the quarantine enclosure the way a candle is present just before it goes out, technically still there, giving less and less light. Every standard intervention had been tried. Bottle feeding from multiple caregivers, surrogate soft toys, heartbeat simulators, recordings of adult capuchin vocalizations, a brief introduction to an older female at the sanctuary who had served as surrogate mother twice before, and who had assessed Mochi from a distance of 2 meters and quietly declined to engage. On the 5th day, Fiona got a call from a colleague at the Fulton County Animal Shelter, 40 minutes north. A golden retriever had come in 3 days earlier. Her name was Hazel. She was 4 years old, healthy, even-tempered, and she had lost her litter of 5 puppies at birth, a uterine complication that the emergency vet had resolved, but too late for the puppies. The shelter coordinator said Hazel was not doing well. She was eating, but only when someone sat beside her. She was not interested in toys or other dogs or the staff who came to check on her. She lay in her kennel and produced milk she had nowhere to send. Fiona sat with that information for about 20 minutes. Then she called the shelter back. The preparation took a day and a half. Fiona consulted 2 primate behaviorists, one of whom told her this was inadvisable, and one of whom said he had read 2 papers suggesting interspecies maternal bonding in mammals under specific stress conditions, and that he was not going to tell her not to try. She had the sanctuary's small observation room cleaned and set up with a low platform, a thick blanket on the floor, and a camera mounted in the upper corner. She arranged for 2 staff members to be present outside the glass at all times. She established a clear intervention threshold: any sign of aggression from Hazel, any sign of acute distress from Mochi, and the session ended immediately. No exceptions. She collected Hazel from the shelter herself, sitting in the back of the van with the dog for the 40-minute drive, letting Hazel rest her head in her lap, noting the way the dog's body held a particular quality of exhausted sadness that Fiona recognized because she had seen it in primates. Not depression exactly. More like an animal that had organized itself around an expectation and was now carrying the weight of an expectation with nothing to attach to. Back at the sanctuary, Fiona carried Mochi into the observation room first and settled her on the platform. Then she brought Hazel in on a loose lead and sat down on the floor 2 meters away, lead in hand, and waited. Hazel looked at Mochi. Mochi was in her default position, curled tight, face down, the small defensive configuration she had held almost continuously since her arrival. She was not moving. She was not making sounds. Hazel took 1 step toward the platform. Fiona held the lead without pulling it. A light tension only. Hazel stopped and lowered her head, her nose working. The room was very quiet. Outside the glass, both keepers had gone completely still. Then Hazel sat down. She was perhaps 1 meter from the platform, and she sat the way dogs sit when they are waiting for something they have decided to be patient about. Her ears were forward. Her tail was not wagging. She was doing the thing that Fiona would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately in her notes. Attending was the word she eventually used. Hazel was attending to Mochi with a quality of focus that was not predatory and not casual. It was maternal. There was no other word for it that fit. 3 minutes passed. Then Mochi lifted her head. Not all the way. Just enough to orient her face toward Hazel. Her eyes, which had been focused on nothing for 5 days, focused on something. Fiona did not move. Hazel made a sound very soft, low in her chest. Not a whine and not a bark. Something that existed in the register that dogs use for their own puppies. A sound that meant, as closely as Fiona could translate it, I am here, and you are safe, and nothing is going to happen. Mochi's left hand uncurled. That was the moment. That one small uncurling of a hand that had been closed for 5 days. Fiona felt it in her chest before she fully processed it visually. Outside the glass, one of the keepers pressed her palm flat against the window. Hazel did not move forward. She continued to sit, continued to produce that soft, low sound. And over the course of the next 20 minutes, Mochi moved toward her. Not quickly. 3 centimeters. Then a pause. 5 more. Then a pause. Each movement a question asked of the air between them. And each time the answer came back the same, the soft sound, the still body, the attending presence. When Mochi finally reached Hazel, she pressed her face into the dog's chest and went still. Hazel lowered her chin onto the top of Mochi's head. Her tail moved once, very slowly. Fiona realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out carefully, trying not to make a sound, trying not to be present in any way that might disturb what was happening on the floor of the observation room. In her notes that evening, she wrote, I have no framework for this. I am going to need a new one. What happened over the following weeks was extraordinary and also, in retrospect, entirely predictable given what had been set in motion in that first session. Mochi began eating, not enthusiastically at first, and not from a bottle held by a human. She would only accept the bottle if Hazel was pressed against her side while she drank. The dog's warmth and smell, and the soft percussion of her heartbeat, providing the context in which eating felt possible. Fiona adapted the feeding protocol accordingly, sitting on the floor with both of them, bottle in one hand, her other hand resting lightly on Hazel's back. Within 10 days, Mochi had stopped losing weight. Within 3 weeks, she was gaining. But the thing that the sanctuary staff began to notice and to discuss, first with curiosity and then with something closer to bewilderment, was not the physical recovery. It was what was happening to Mochi's behavior. Capuchin monkeys are extraordinarily observant animals. They learn by watching. They absorb behavioral patterns from their social group with a precision that researchers have spent decades documenting. Mochi was watching Hazel the way infant capuchins watch their mothers constantly, completely, storing every gesture and sound in response as information about how the world works and how a body should move through it. And Hazel, with no awareness of what she was teaching her everything she knew. The first thing the keepers noticed was the greeting behavior. When Fiona arrived each morning, Hazel would stand and move toward the door, tail in motion. Within 2 weeks, Mochi had begun doing the same, standing upright, both arms raised, body oriented toward the sound of the approaching truck. She could not wag a tail she didn't have. She compensated by vibrating her entire back end. The keeper who first witnessed it had to leave the room to compose herself. Then there was the sitting. Capuchin monkeys do not sit the way dogs sit. Their anatomy does not favor it, but Mochi had begun attempting it, settling back onto her haunches with her front limbs arranged in front of her in a clear imitation of Hazel's resting posture, holding the position until she tipped sideways, then trying again. And when something frightened her, she did not retreat to a high corner the way capuchins typically did. She went to the floor. She pressed her face down. The appeasement posture. A dog's posture, not a monkey's. Fiona documented all of it, and then she went home on a Tuesday evening and sat at her kitchen table for a long time before she could decide how to feel about what she was watching. Because the data was clear, the problem was that the data was pointing in two directions at once. The question she was sitting with was not a simple one. Mochi was thriving. By every measurable metric, the intervention had worked beyond any reasonable expectation. She was gaining weight, developing normally, engaging with enrichment, showing curiosity about her environment. Hazel was also thriving. The milk had gradually resolved. The hollowed-out quality in her eyes had filled back in. She had found a purpose for the organization that had been pointed nowhere and was now pointed at something small and dependent and entirely real. Two animals who had each lost the thing they were built around had found a way to become that thing for each other. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, one of the more remarkable things Fiona had witnessed in 14 years. The question was, what came next? Because the protocol, the reason Cedar Ridge existed, the reason anyone did this work was clear. Capuchin monkeys were not meant to live with dogs. They were meant to live with other capuchins, in complex social groups that would provide the full range of behavioral and psychological experiences that a capuchin needed to be a capuchin. Mochi was going to need to be integrated into the sanctuary's main capuchin group. That was not a question. That was the entire point. Except that, when the integration team tried to begin the first stage of introduction fence-line contact with two of the younger capuchins from the main group, Mochi reacted in a way that none of them had anticipated. She pressed herself against the fence, not in the orientation posture of an animal seeking connection with its own kind. She pressed herself against the fence in the appeasement posture. Face down, front limbs flat, body low. The posture Hazel used when she was trying to communicate that she was not a threat. The other capuchins investigated her with the cautious curiosity of animals encountering something familiar in shape but confusing in behavior. They reached through the fence. Mochi flinched. Not because she was afraid of them exactly, but because she had no vocabulary for what they were doing. She had spent her entire developmental window learning one language, and it was not the one being spoken at her through the fence. The integration team ran the session for 40 minutes and pulled back. They ran it again 2 days later with the same result. On the third attempt, the older of the two capuchins on the other side of the fence made the species-specific greeting vocalization, the contact call that capuchins exchange when they recognize each other as part of the same social group. Mochi looked at Hazel. She looked at the capuchin. She looked back at Hazel. And then she turned around and walked away from the fence. Fiona sat with her team in the staff room that evening, and nobody said very much for a while. Then the youngest keeper, who was 23 years old and had been at Cedar Ridge for 8 months, said what everyone was thinking. She doesn't know she's a monkey. That was the beginning of a conversation that had no protocol to guide it. The sanctuary had procedures for animals shaped by excessive human contact, managed long-term care. No wild release. Permanent controlled environment. But Mochi had not been shaped by human contact. She had been shaped by Hazel, which was a different problem entirely. because the solution was not as simple as reducing human interaction. Hazel was not the problem. Hazel was the reason Mochi was alive. So the team did something not in any protocol Fiona had access to. They tried it the other way around. And if you think about what that required, not just logistically, but in terms of admitting that the standard playbook had no page for what they were looking at, that decision was harder than it sounds. Instead of introducing Mochi to the capuchin group without Hazel, they began bringing Hazel to the fence line sessions. Hazel on one side of the fence, Mochi on the same side as Hazel. The capuchins on the other side, investigating, and gradually, session by session, Mochi began to observe that the capuchins were not a threat because Hazel was not treating them as a threat. Hazel's body language was relaxed. Hazel was curious. Hazel would sit near the fence and watch the capuchins with the same attending quality she brought to everything. And Mochi watched Hazel watch them and began, slowly, to take the same posture. It took 3 months. It was not linear and it was not without setbacks. But by the end of those 3 months, Mochi was making fence-line contact with the younger capuchins, tentative, brief, punctuated by retreats to Hazel's side. But real contact, genuine inquiry, the beginning of a social vocabulary in a language she had not been born knowing. The full integration took 6 more months. Hazel was present for much of it, not inside the capuchin enclosure, but visible, accessible, the fixed point that Mochi navigated from. And as the months passed, the radius of Mochi's confidence expanded, and the fixed point became less necessary. And then one day, Fiona realized she had been watching Mochi for 40-minutes, and the younger capuchin female was grooming her, and she had not looked toward Hazel once. That evening, Fiona wrote in her case notes, "Successful integration. Mochi is functioning within the capuchin social group with appropriate behavioral and communicative competency. Hazel remains on site in an adjacent enclosure." She paused. Then she added one more line. "Mochi still sits facing the door." 5 years later, Cedar Ridge had a research partnership with the University of Georgia that had produced one published paper on cross-species behavioral transmission in primates and a second one under review. The second paper included a section Fiona's co-author had tried 3 times to get her to rephrase documentation of a juvenile male capuchin, born at the sanctuary 8 months after Mochi's integration, who had been observed performing what could only be described as an attempt at a tail wag using the limited range of motion available to a capuchin's spine. Hazel was 9. Living in the enclosure adjacent to the capuchin group, she and Mochi spent most mornings near the shared fence line, Hazel on one side, Mochi on the other, in the particular proximity of 2 animals who did not need to be in the same space to be together. On a Thursday afternoon, Fiona sat on the bench outside the enclosure and watched Mochi grooming the older female capuchin with the focused, competent attention of an animal fully integrated into her social group. At the far end of the enclosure, near the shared fence line, Hazel was lying in a patch of afternoon sun. Her eyes were half closed. Her tail moved once in a slow arc. On the other side of the fence, without looking up from her grooming, Mochi's back end moved in the small, involuntary motion that it always did when Hazel's tail moved. She had been doing it for 5 years. She would probably do it for the rest of her life. Fiona stopped trying to find the right clinical language for it a long time ago. Some things you just write down and leave alone.